Thank you. I'm Adrian, this is Bill, and the way this is going to work is basically we will finish at 3 o'clock, whatever happens. And I will be basically interrupting Bill, who will be driving through most of the slides, and you will presumably be interrupting us, or at least heckling. Although we've got a list of questions, which is on a slide, which will go in the Q&A session. But it strikes me that this, I've never done a talk where we've had the questions before we've done the talk. Does this mean you're all psychic? And, you know, is this an audience of psychics we've got here? It's certainly a room full of PhDs, which made me think, well, what's a collective noun for a room full of PhDs? And I came up, from my perspective, with a persecution of PhDs. I don't know about... Now, Bill and I have worked together for, since the 20th century, basically. And as the years go by, we get more and more frustrated. And basically because the world doesn't seem to be doing what we think it ought to do. And what we're going to tell you today is what we think, from our perspective, the world ought to be doing. And you'll see why we're frustrated. So if we start ranting at some point, then please understand. We're prone to it. And we're quite happy to accept heckling and observations during the presentation. But we'll be blitzing you with about 6 hours worth of material compressed into an hour. Because this is a masterclass and it's supposed to be based on, you know, the full experience that we've had over these years. Now, it means the bandwidth of your brains has got to be wider than most audiences, okay? And we're assuming that. We're assuming that you're motivated, you know, intelligent and you're brainy, which is obviously a mistake anyway. Now, I'll just let Bill get on with it, and he'll then cue me wherever necessary, where he feels the need. And that's the way things are going to work. We've also got Isabel Carmona with us, who is basically just asked to come along. And I know that one or two of you have already asked us, can we meet up at some point during the day? And the answer is yes, we can, but I can't predict exactly when. So, take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Adrian. Yes, we got into an incredible shrinking masterclass slot. I'm not sure if I need that. Just a sec. Firstly, can you hear me from these mics here? So you keep the mic there, so you can wander around. I'll just wander around near here, if that's all right. So we prepared 4 presentations, but I think we're only going to use 2 of them in the time slot we've got available, but we may jump around a bit. So the first one is very much thinking about the role of building professionals, because, as somebody said, I forget, but you know, climate change and sustainability requires us to be more moral than we could ever imagine. So the whole area that we have to think very differently about the way things are happening. Oh, and there's a hashtag if you want to Twitter how awful this is. Just to remind you of that. It's big picture, so I think you can remember that. Now, there seems to be a culture at the moment that sees buildings as just another product. You know, why can't buildings be like cars or iPhones or things like that? You think I do need it?
You do for the recording.
Ah. But they're a very slow rotation product. I mean, what we find looking at buildings is they're designed for a life of, well, these days it's often sort of 50 or 60 years, unless it's a supermarket or something like that. But what you find is, one, when people have a building, they either wish it would last forever or they wish they hadn't got it. You know, so that tends to happen very rapidly. And the second thing is, what we find again and again is the newer they are, the shorter they last, and the more they cost to look after. So that isn't very sustainable, is it? But essentially, you know, many changing purposes over the years, and there's very, very little feedback on their performance to their creators. So there's a complete knowledge gap, complete lack of feedback generally in the construction industry. They cut the tape and they walk away. And, you know, so we've got this building stock which lasts a long time, and having a good building stock is really important to the nation. You know, it's a nice place to live. You don't get unhealthy in it. You know, you can afford to occupy it. All sorts of good things happen if you get it right. All sorts of studies have been done saying, only we got rid of moulds in housing, we'd take £1 billion off the asthma bill or whatever. And industry isn't actually in the same place at all. It's about capturing customers. Government, which used to close the feedback loop, has essentially outsourced and privatized its brain, so it no longer knows enough about what's happening. And everybody's wanting whizzy gizmos in buildings. They don't understand that innovation isn't about grabbing some whizzy thing from the blue sky and sort of forcing it down the throat of the market. You know, buildings people don't rush off to buy things like the latest iPad or whatever. It's actually about getting people and processes and things together in better ways in order, from very much the same ingredients, to deliver incredibly better results. And of course, a lot of the ingredients we have in buildings these days, and we're talking about, you know, decarbonization targets for 2050 and that sort of thing, but, you know, most of the buildings we're going to have then are there now. So essentially, an awful lot about making the best of what we've got. So there's an awful lot of work that building professional needs to do. How many people here call yourselves building professionals? About a third, I suppose, something like that. So the rest of you are researchers. But hopefully you're professionals in building performance, because that's what you're researching into. So, you know, we've got an enormous job to do, and, you know, the wallets are empty. We're very, very bad at procuring buildings, because instead of saying, look, we want to do something different, we don't quite know what it is, we need to pursue design intent through to reality, see how things have worked, pass on our understanding as a curator of the building, and take that information back so that we can improve our own practice, improve the industry practice, help the occupiers and owners of the building improve its performance. They just cut the tape and walk away. But not only that, if you look inside a construction procurement process, you find it salami sliced. You know, somebody does a feasibility study about the costs and benefits, somebody else will get planning permission, somebody else will develop the design to a sort of scheme stage, then it'll be handed over to design and build contractor, and then they'll hand it over to some sort of management outfit. And it's just completely hopeless. You know, how can we use the existing tools to do the job we need to do? Now, we've got all these institutions, etc., which have got tremendous inertia. But why haven't we got so much inertia? Well, maybe we do in our brains. You know, there's a way of just thinking about things a weeny bit differently, and suddenly things can be better. So, you know, forget about 2050 and the rest of it. That's just an excuse for delay. You know, what we've got to do is do things very, very differently from now on. So what might we do? Well, one of them is, if you look at the codes of professional institutions, they usually ask their members to understand and practice sustainable development. Well, how on earth can you be doing that if you don't look at what you've produced? I mean, it's completely stupid. So essentially, you know, you've got to say, hang on a moment. You know, society is trusting professionals to deliver stuff in the public interest, but actually society has created a process for reducing buildings, doesn't do it. So how about thinking a bit differently, redefining the roles? So, you know, we do follow through, we do engage with outcomes. That's the nature of the job. You know, people say it can't be afforded, but how can you afford not to do it? I mean, what we find often from reviewing building performance is that it's not, when buildings don't work well, it's not there wasn't enough money spent on it. It wasn't spent in the right places. Because people have been going through this salami slice procurement system, you know, sparing no expense to get something on the cheap, and they hadn't brought things together properly. Now, the other thing is that not only closing the feedback loop, is there's this disconnect between the ground truth, what's happening in research and practice, and what policy is doing about it. So what we've had, particularly in the last decade or so, is a whole lot of regulations based on what looks good rather than what works good. I was just talking before this lecture with somebody who's been investigating heat pumps. Well, 30 years ago we looked at heat pumps and said, it's all about the applications engineering, but now heat pumps, they're efficient, aren't they? Well, not necessarily. And what about, if everybody has a heat pump, then what on earth is going to do with the electricity network in the middle of the winter? And also they're called renewable heat, where all they're doing is grabbing back all that waste heat you've shoved out in the power station. Now, we've got the most extraordinary errors going on in the way that government is trying, through regulation and incentives, to influence the market, whatever that is, for building performance. So, a sort of long catalogue here. This slide will come up a few times in the presentations. You need to see it all. But essentially, going from the first glimmer of what's required through to the production of a building, there's a whole important job to do of engaging with outcomes. Now, you engage with outcomes, those of you who are looking into building performance. But how well is that connected with practice and policy making? I think rather better than it has been, but there is an enormous disconnect for the most part. Now, Adrian and I started seeing each other in the sort of mid-90s when Adrian joined a firm called Building Use Studies. And he was managing director, and they approached me and said, we want you to work more closely with them. And I said, I'm terribly sorry, I can't, because I've just accepted a chair at University College London. And Adrian said, you'll regret it. And I'm afraid I did, and I only lasted a very short time, so now I'm Professor D Emeritus. But anyway, having come out of University College London, I had a very big job, proportionately for a one-man business, on looking at energy use in offices. And so it was a 2-year project that got expanded to 3 years, which took me about 40% of my time. Actually managed to look at 100 buildings in detail, data provided, of which I visited 50, and did publish case studies on 25, of which about 16 got published. The others got buried down a memory hole for one reason or other. Now, this was one. Now, what happened? I was talking about these in the late 80s, and Adrian was talking about a rather similar study he'd done, the Office Environment Survey, which was occupant questionnaires in 50 office buildings. So a really big study, 100 people or more, wasn't in each of those. So, both of us have got quite big databases. And what we were trying to do is sort of put them together. Now, one building, which I'll talk about a bit this evening, the Policy Studies Institute, was the only building in the 2 databases, and it was reasonably good for energy, and it was very good for occupant satisfaction. What was happening there? So this was another, the Policy Studies Institute was actually case study number 1. This is case study number 21. Unfortunately, all these from the Energy Efficiency Best Practice Program, which got thrown away, in 2002 when it got handed over to the Carbon Trust. But this building, in spite of the photograph which shows all these lights on, well, it seems to be quite bright outside, for an air-conditioned building was extraordinarily energy efficient. It had a carbon footprint similar to that of most naturally ventilated office buildings. So what happened there? So what happened is I had the opportunity, there was a little window between about 1992 and 1995 where Adrian and I did our best research working together. And the main reason was it was the only period in which nearly all the building-related research stuff in government was in one place. Because we had a Department of Environment, which included not what is now Department of Communities and Local Government, but also it had in it, it had Property Services Agency. That unfortunately shriveled up and went away in the early 90s, but they knew about running buildings. It had the building regs bit, but it also had the building research bit. It was responsible as intelligent customer for the building research establishment. And then I think it was in 91, 92, the Department of Energy got abolished. That was 89, I think. And the Department of Energy's stuff on buildings came into the Department of the Environment. So suddenly you had a bit of a joined-up focus in government for research, which then started falling apart with privatisation of BRE, and then New Labour scattered the whole thing to the four winds, unfortunately. So what happened is, with this building, having got good for energy, I managed to convince BRE that why don't we do some occupant surveys in this and see whether it's good for occupants or not. And it was. And so we started, Adrian started doing calculations and things on this. We had Occupant Survey, which told us about a number of things. And we were trying to do correlations. I don't know whether you want to talk about this, Adrian. I'll just do a little bit of an overview. But one thing was to sort of then look at, once you got information on quite a lot of buildings, and this was actually some work we did on minimizing and avoiding air conditioning, where we brought in, because we were looking, in the 80s, we were looking solely at energy performance as technical performance. And what I found is there were issues on the people side in terms of not only occupant satisfaction in buildings, but the way people procured buildings. And Adrian found there were similar problems on the technical side. He couldn't quite understand why the people were behaving in the way they were without understanding more about the technology. And what we then discovered when we worked together is some of the classifications of buildings in the office environment study, which was trying to correlate building services and building type with occupant satisfaction, were not actually rich enough to describe the context. So, for example, there seemed to be a correlation coming out of the studies that air-conditioned buildings with fan coils were better for occupant satisfaction than air-conditioned buildings with variable volume systems. But what we found is it wasn't actually cause and effect, it was association. Because at the time, the offices with fan coils tended to have fan coils around the perimeter. So there would tend to be more shallow plan buildings with more natural light available and more cellular offices in them, where the variable volume systems were deep plan buildings which were much more dependent on management. We also found that air-conditioned buildings generally seem to be less healthy than natural ventilated buildings. So, again, the knee-jerk thing is natural ventilation good, air condition bad. What we found emerging from this is it wasn't that, it was simple buildings good, complicated buildings bad. And what we found in the 90s is the complication which were causing management problems in air-conditioned buildings was creeping into naturally ventilated buildings as people were trying to do more sustainable, lower energy buildings to a brief for an air-conditioned building with a technology for a naturally ventilated building. So, you know, what you find is when you start working in an interdisciplinary way, and this is just two disciplines working together, you suddenly get completely different insights than the blinkered data gives you. But so often the methods and standards and priorities in academe is to look at things in a blinkered way. Now, I'm sure the Energy Institute isn't doing that, but it's the sort of thing which can be very difficult in relation to academic value systems, which tends to be drilling deep on a single issue rather than going broad and trying to find what's happening on an issue which involves a whole lot of things interacting. So anyway, going back to the slide, one of the sort of obsessions sometimes is, you know, do buildings make people more productive? You know, what's the formula? What's the magic formula for making people more productive? And what we found is one of the things which seemed to be correlated with better self-assessed productivity was better perceived control. Or possibly the opposite, that people's productivity was depressed where they felt they weren't in control. And there have been various social studies that have also done that. I know Michael Marmot, an epidemiologist here who works with the Energy Institute too, looked at sort of job satisfaction for civil servants. And essentially, you know, the less control they had, the less job satisfaction they had. You know, the ones who had lots of control had much more control over their lives. The ones who had very little, who had to sort of sit in this corner of the office and do something, you know, in an area where the air conditioning system was dumping cold air on them at 5 meters a second or whatever. So then we found that, quite interestingly, a lot of the productivity was related to speed of response. So it was the control was related partly to, if I have a problem, does it get fixed or doesn't it? And things can respond in a number of different ways. I mean, initially this was sort of the formula. Oh, well, if you want something to respond, what everybody needs is sort of, you know, desks that look like flight decks. So you twiddle a knob and your lights go up and down and the air can go up and down. You have a heater panel underneath and that sort of thing. But if you're not careful, you get unmanageable technical complication there. What it really meant is that if you had a building that could get you out of trouble when you were in trouble, you were much happier with it than if you weren't. And then Adrian found, he was doing surveys in Australia, and found that people in Australia were happier in buildings, in office buildings, than people seemed to be in Britain. Well, you know, what was so special about Australia? Well, when Adrian looked at the correlations, what he found was a correlation between how happy you were in a building, an inverse correlation, the amount of time you spent in it. And what happens, Australians were much more likely to pop out for lunch and do that sort of thing. It's more of an outdoor culture. And when you actually controlled for that, you found Australian buildings were rather more similar to British buildings. So what we came up with, this was about 1994, wasn't it, Adrian, is this little sort of trivial snibbo strategic diagram, which just said that if you have a situation where the design strategically has been thinking about the manageability and usability of the building, then you can get a situation where the management of the building, and these were office buildings generally need a bit of management, could create positive associations between human performance and energy efficiency. Now, actually, I'll keep that one. I thought I had, I was forgetting as a slide I've got more information on, but it's not this one. So, what we found is we could name often the people who'd been responsible for being more aware of what might happen in use in terms of design. And I remember there were three of them started us to form this hypothesis. One was on the Policy Studies Institute, which was Mayor Hillman, who you may know was the author of How We Can Save the Planet, which was written about 8 years ago, who was an architect who turned into a policy analyst, who was really, really interested in client requirements while they were refurbishing this building. On Onebright Street, it was actually an advisor to the client who was coming into a rented building which was being built for him, who was really red hot on client requirements for usability and control and things like that. On another, it was the body shop. And so the whole body shop culture actually again pushed the developer to providing a building which was more related to what they felt was good for their needs as a customer, but nevertheless had an exit strategy into the main market. And it's time for Adrian.
Yes, I was kind of waving my hand about there to make a point. Here, we're into territory here where you've got to be very careful. All this productivity in building stuff is an obsession of corporate management. And they will see a building only in terms of a very restricted view of human performance and workplace productivity. And on our questionnaire, perceived productivity is just 1 out of 64 questions. And I plead with the managers, look, we're studying building performance here. We're not actually studying workplace productivity. We're looking at a bigger picture, more interdependent. Now, when we get to this, we slung together as a diagram to explain probably about 2 hours worth of stuff in 30 seconds. And we also did some work, I did, which was never published because Bill said don't publish it, which actually showed, we looked at the energy efficiency of a set of buildings, and we looked at some of the human performance data, and stuck them on a scatter plot, and guess what? There is a relationship between human performance and energy efficiency. Now, if we go down that road, the reason we didn't publish it was because there are only 20 buildings, and 20 is a terribly small sample to start going around saying that there is a relationship between energy efficiency and human performance, especially when the world is full of academics who will chop your knees off for stuff like this and you know, the work has got to be good enough to convince an audience like you, especially the professors sitting in the front row, who will chop your knees off. Now, here, I did the scatter plot, and we got a correlation of about 0.45 between human performance and energy efficiency. Wow, that's good, let's publish it. No way, says Bill. And in one of the questions later on, the dreaded word forensic appears, forensic proof. Do you have forensic proof? No, we don't. What we found was that through case study work, through what I call shaker statistics, unnormalized data that you can understand, basically, no principal components analysis or cluster analysis or factor analysis, stay well clear from all that, because you'll just rearrange your own ignorance, and 3 years later we'll be back where you started. Be warned. Any of you doing that? No, thank God for that. Now, the thing was, what you tend to find, okay, at a statistical level, it's all a bit noisy and a bit difficult. But when you start talking to people in buildings and talking to the managers and talking and seeing what's going on, we're empiricists, we love case studies. We love chatting to people. We're not scared of them. And what you find is that very highly motivated people on the management team or even on the design team who understand what the building is for and perhaps have a brief which sets out clearly what the ends are that are trying to be achieved. And when you have those people who are motivated enough to actually take on board the rest of the world, then you get a relationship between an energy efficient building and human performance. And over again, we find that the really great buildings, the energy efficient ones, have got one person somewhere in the system who is incredibly motivated to get the thing done properly. The attention to detail, the human relations. And in the case of Onebright Street, yes, there was a facility manager called Nick Hann who was unbelievably good at monitoring performance, responding to requests and complaints, and so on. Now, the light bulb moment, and there are about 3 we've had over the last 25 years, light bulb moment number 1 is, it's not really about design. It's much, much, much more about management. And I always used, for the first 10 years of studying buildings, I thought, it's design, it's physical. No, it's not. Design tends to be part of the constraint set as much as part of the solution set. It is the motivation of people within the system that actually is really important here. Now, some of you will say, I know what you're thinking, I'm also psychic. They say, tell us something we don't know. We know this already. Well, why in the hell do you pursue the statistical and the modeling routes all the time? Why is there so much of this? Why is it virtualized so much now? Why are people so scared of going into buildings and actually studying real performance? Well, we're going to be telling you. But light bulb moment number 1 is motivated people in the system are the major explanatory variable of the relationship between a great, well-performing building, which is usually an energy-efficient one, and human performance. Right.
Thanks, Adrian. You used my name slightly in vain, because I don't think I was the one who trashed your report. If you remember, in about 1994, you were invited by the Energy Efficiency Best Practice Program to do a good practice case study, or I don't know, maybe a general information leaflet on that, which was drafted, and they just didn't know what to do with it. Because essentially the mindset was that this was a technological problem. And the fact that, moving the goalposts, saying, hang on a moment, you've got your concept wrong, was just something the system could not swallow at the time. So, the other thing that's really interesting, Adrian talked about Onebright Street. Onebright Street had actually got characters in both the strategic design and the client requirements, and Nick Han on the management, which client requirement, the advisor said you really need a red-hot facilities manager here in order to meet your ambitions, and it did come together. So we had this extraordinary air-conditioned building, good occupant satisfaction, energy performance similar to a naturally ventilated building. Now, unfortunately, these things can be fragile. And here is the energy information for One Bridewell Street. Now, what we had was, this is a breakdown, that's in CO2, of a good practice, sorry, a typical office from Energy Consumption Guide 19, which was one of the products of the case studies that we did. You can't believe it, Energy Consumption Guide 19 is still in print. And the research to produce it was done in the late 80s. First edition, 1990, it was updated, but not very much in 97. It's still there. Before the Carbon Trust closed down, it was in their top 5 publications. It is ridiculous. Why aren't we keeping these things up to date? But anyway, let's go back to that. Typical, good practice. This is where One Bridewell Street was. So nearly all the end uses were considerably less, even the good practice benchmark for the air-conditioned building. And the main reason was that the designers had been forced into it by the client advisor, which is the same had happened on the other buildings. The side was dragged screaming behind strong client requirements. They're either very well informed or alternatively wouldn't take no for an answer and kept on asking questions and talking to people until they, yeah, I think I'm happy with it. I think I feel it might right. Now what happened is when it came to the rent review in 1996, Nick Han came to me and they said, MEPC, who rents us the building, wants to put the rent up because it's an energy efficient building. Can you please tell me how much is due to MEPC, how much is due to what we added as an occupier as part of our client requirements, and how much is due to me? So I did an analysis. And the analysis was, that was the difference between Nick Han not being in the building and Nick Han being in the building. So an enormous issue. Now, unfortunately, this story has a sad outcome. Now, actually, this must not be recorded, so I've got to, I don't know what we can do on this. We're going to have a bit of censorship, I think, afterwards.
We will have to censor you, Bill.
10 years ago, they got rid of Nick Han. Why did they get rid of Nick Han? Because the occupier, as an organization, outsourced its facilities management to a facilities management company. Guess what happened to the energy consumption? It doubled. Nick Han understood the buildings, understood its systems, understood the occupants. The outsourced company was just providing a standard service, and unfortunately the standard service around all the facilities management companies is a mediocre service. It can't be anything else because they'd show up all the rest of their portfolio. So some things can be fragile. Now, this is another building. Can we turn the lights off there? You know, that would be nice, wouldn't it, if you didn't have the lights on the screen? Is there any way of doing that?
I think there is. I think that's it there.
Full and out, it says here, but probably I'll plunge everybody. Shall I try something in between? Try two. Well done, Bob. Oh, no, I think we've dimmed everything down. But anyway, is that all right? Can you still read your notes and things? Is that a bit better? So this was the very first of the probe studies we did in 1995, where what we were trying to do is we were doing this research and coming up with general things. We said, let's try and look through buildings which have been recently completed to make some of these findings more real. And this was the administrative office in Standard Life in Edinburgh. It's the water relief comes through here. In fact, it was behind an old wool market, I think it is, so one facade of this was actually listed, but they built this big pentagonal building behind it, which contained 3,000 people on 2 floors, and it was, I think, 125 meters across on the long diagonal. A massive deep plan building. It was actually mixed mode. You had this glassy facade, but it was ventilated behind. It was a double envelope. You could open the windows in between. You could let some of the heat out in the atria. The 3 atria punched into it. And I went there and I rang Adrian and said, I think we got a good building here. And Adrian said, you must be off your trolley. We've done all these sick building studies, and buildings that are 125 meters deep are going to be impossible to manage, and it's going to be a sick building. Just look at the bloody thing inside. And it's full of Scottish clerical staff. This can't possibly be a good building. Well, it was when we did the Occupant Survey. And guess what the reason was? It was the same formula. Good briefing, lot of attention to detail in production, extraordinarily good and responsive facilities management in a system where people couldn't do very much. I mean, they could play with the windows if they wanted to. You see that sash is open on the double envelope. But, you know, if you're 50 meters away from it, so what? You know, so a lot of stuff really what that. But essentially, we found again and again that good formulae were where this had happened, and then things responded rapidly. So what happened is, hopefully you didn't get into a problem, but they knew in One Bridewell Street, and they knew in Tanfield House, that if they had a problem with the internal environment, lifted up the phone, something would be done. Now, what was quite extraordinary is that when we actually showed the results to the facilities manager, well, it turned out that Standard Life in Edinburgh had 65 facilities staff, of which quite a lot of them were in this building. I don't know how many were running the building, but 30, say. You know, so it had a very high staffing rate. It was one facilities management staff for every 1,000 square meters of building. And we found there were technical problems, and we found there were some issues. And we said the reason why people like this building as much as they do is because of rapid response by facilities management. And this was in 1997. No, 1995, we did actually survey it. Or 1997, when they took it off. The facilities manager had also been responsible for procuring the building, but he was head of facilities management when they occupied it. So again, golden thread. You know, he'd actually procured the site, appointed the design team, procured the building, and was now responsible for running it. He took our report to the board and said, it says here that our rapid response is improving occupant satisfaction. Please, can we have more money for facilities so that we can do this even better? Because, you know, our customers are the staff, and if the staff are happier and more productive, that's good for Standard Life. So they got more money. They also had the technical agenda. There were some technical problems in this building, but they followed them up. The variable speed drives are crap. Put in new ones. The variable volume system doesn't work very well. Get Manchester University, who've done a lot of work on variable volume system control, to come in, do an investigation, tell us how to sort it out. So these virtuous circles were really working. So what you found in the productivity data is that these were the first 7, I think it was, or so, of the probe studies we did. Here's Tanfield House self-assessed productivity, plus 8%. Now, fairly meaningless, but what we do know is self-assessed is correlated in some way with actual. So 96th percentile, so nearly at the top of the list. Then Woodhouse Medical Centre, which was a tiny little surgery in Sheffield, at the opposite end of the scale, naturally ventilated, openable windows, doctor's surgery, super insulated by the veils, right at the top of the scale. Whereas some other buildings, which were written up as being fantastic, were not necessarily quite so good, including things like de Montfort-Leicester, which has the big wind towers and the rest of it, which, you know, looked really good in terms of a sustainable building, looks really good for attracting students, but tended to have put the staff in the worst bits of the building, where I think, what were you measuring? I think you measured about 28 degrees in February, didn't you, in one place? And you found the most disgruntled occupant that you've ever seen in any building. In fact, we used to have it in our slides, didn't we? It's called the Puce Pom, which was this really disgruntled person with a thermohydrograph on his desk, experiencing this dreadful environment in the middle of this open plan space, which was a space left over after the gestures. Adrian.
Well, we're now in shoot the messenger territory, because I mean, this kind of early data set is contradicting some of the myths that are pervasive. For example, the de Montfort Queen's building, you'll find virtually in every single book on green buildings, and it's always chapter 7. And by implication, it's good. When we looked at it, it was almost frighteningly ungood or not good. I'm not going to use the bad word, because the shoot the messenger stuff is you can't really go around saying buildings are bad because of all the people whose reputations and vested interests are going to be wrecked by it. And that means when you're reporting this stuff, you must do it you do it carefully and objectively and make sure your data are reported properly. But we published these studies in Building Services Journal. Now, Building Services Journal has the huge advantage that nobody reads it. You get it, but nobody reads it. That means it took about 2 years. All our probe studies are in Building Services Journal. It took about 2 years before anybody twigged that this kind of data was in the public domain. And we got a couple of solicitors' letters by disgruntled architectural practices who didn't really approve of the PR that apparently we were not pushing. You know, you've got to report it carefully, objectively, independently, and very carefully. But you tend to you almost always accentuate the positive, but also you try and eliminate the negative. I'm going to start singing in a minute. There's a song.
Don't do that.
What is there's a song that goes like that. Now, what it actually means is that we started thinking, well, we're doing the opposite of what statisticians do. Statisticians get rid of the outliers. They look at a scatter plot and say, well, no, get rid of the extremes. We don't want those. And we're looking at our data set saying, oh, look at these extremes. We do want those. We want to learn from the extremes, the very good and the very bad. Now, the very good story of, say, Brenda and Robert Vale's Woodhouse Medical Centre confirmed a lot of our thinking about small buildings and naturally ventilated buildings and how much people like them. But you'll always find a counterexample. You'll find a small naturally ventilated building that is frying people and is causing them extreme distress. And if you do, you want to understand why. Now, we're looking at the One Bridewell Street, which is basically a naturally ventilated building in drag. You look at the data and you think this building's naturally ventilated, but it's air conditioned. What are the things that are driving this? And this is where the case studies are incredibly important. And we got to know Nick Han very well, and we also got to know Brenda and Robert Vale very well. Robert Vale, just for the historical record, and this is being recorded, is now driving trams in Wellington, New Zealand. I was fortunate enough to stay with him, and he said, would you like a ride on my tram? And he's got a full-size tram. I mean, this is what happens to you later in life.
He is still at the university.
And I've lost my thread now.
It's all right. So hand back to me.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the reason we have on our questionnaires, people often ask about questionnaire design, and we have a question on age, and it's basically 30 or under, or over 30. And basically that, and they say, what's your rationale for that? And my rationale was that when I ran up the escalators at Holborn Station, age 30, my knees started going. In other words, that's the threshold when you start getting chronic ailments and ill and old.
But I'm going to add to that, because you also had, I think, 5-year age brackets in an earlier questionnaire, and essentially, over and under 30 was very much a dividing line.
The ludicrous thing about the questionnaire we inherited was that there's too many stupid questions and too much data. All you need to know about a building is it full of youngsters, or are they getting on a bit? Because the younger ones tend to be locked into the building, they're not allowed out, whereas the older ones roam around a lot. And you also find that the data for people who are in buildings less of the time seem to be happier. than those who are there all the time, especially if they are young women in the middle of open plan who are Scottish, which is what, I mean, forget the Scottish bit. I can't resist putting that in when we're talking about Tanfield House, because, as you know, it had every single indicator of being a sick building, except that it wasn't. It had an incredibly good management environment, and there we go again. You know, air-conditioned building, not naturally ventilated. Well, it was mixed, it was a little bit mixed smoke. But it seemed to be contradicting ourselves all the time. Don't go with the myths. Go with the data. Go with what you can see. And that's the road that we've been going down.
Thank you, Adrian. So now over to Bob Lowe, because when we did probe of this building at University of East Anglia, we found it was another eureka moment, in that it was a building that had been procured for a university. Essentially, it had sort of staff offices here, social spaces here, seminar rooms on the ground floor, and lecture rooms in the basement, that recalibrated the benchmarks, because this building didn't have air conditioning, but it had better occupant satisfaction with summer comfort than any air-conditioned building. It also had an amazingly, for the time, low heating energy consumption. And we wrote it up in Building Services Journal, a journal of chronic diseases, as Adrian said, and the Architects Journal was so impressed that they reproduced some stuff there, and Bob wrote a letter to the Architects Journal. You know, here's this building which on performance is fantastic, and it didn't even make the shortlist for the Green Building of the Year award. Actually, I did review the building which did make the shortlist for the Green Building of the Year award, and it, rather than Elizabeth Fry, was using 2.5 times the energy that had been predicted by the designers. But, you know, it had all the spin, this had the substance. Now, what was the substance? Well, the substance was in the soft side. It wasn't just in the hard side of things. There were a number of things you had to do in order to get a good building related on that little bubble diagram we had before. So the first thing was getting the stuff set up, and suddenly, you know, you find you can name these. A good client was Peter York, who was the estates bursar at the time at University of East Anglia, who had procured a whole range of buildings, starting with the Sainsbury Centre and things like that, which was actually quite an expense, but going through a number of allegedly energy-efficient buildings. And he got up the learning curve on client requirements. And so he got a good brief, but he also got a good team together, because he didn't have to shop around. He found a team who'd actually worked well on a building that had been procured on the campus. In fact, it was one that had been procured for the NHS rather than for himself. But nevertheless, aha, I can work with these people. So he said, we really want to push the boat out now. You know, just got an ordinary budget, but I really want to try and pull off a low-energy building this time. And the team said, we're not sure whether we can go on the stretch that you want us to go on. We don't know whether we've got the knowledge. So they pulled in David Olivier, who's an energy anorak, who's worked with Bob Lowe in the past, etc., who had recently completed studies of low-energy buildings in North America and in Europe. So David came in, and he could give them a lot of assistance, particularly on fabric energy performance. So they managed to have a super-insulated building with triple glazed 2+1 windows and things. It started going a bit flaky in a few places, like roof lights and entrance doors and things. And then the building services were related on a Swedish system, which had ventilated hollow concrete slabs, a thing called Thermodec. I think it was the third example of Thermodec in the UK, but it was really the first example that worked properly, because it was actually put together as an integrated solution, where the other ones were rather more put together as, oh, well, here's a nice product, can't we use it? Which often seems to happen. This is the trouble. You find the people who really care integrate things properly, and the people who don't, they go, oh, I'll have one of those. But particularly if you're going to more sustainable solutions, you tend often to be climbing a ladder at which you have to get everything right at every step to meet the plateau where the building performs well, because you don't have the opportunity to turn up the wick on the technology in the way we've tended to do in more traditional, more highly serviced solutions. So they got a pretty good design. Design in haste, repent at leisure, you know. Essentially, they allowed enough time to do it. They managed to do something that was quite simple and straightforward. As you saw from the photograph, the building is fairly simple in terms of its geometry, which is the same as we often get today with passive house and things like that. It's much easier to make a cube thermally efficient than things that are sprawling around all over the place. And they were lucky, or maybe they weren't, I don't know, but they had a contractor who was up to the task. You know, they realized they were on the stretch. They wanted to look good by producing a good building. And they had a traditional contract, so they were more good. They had a clerk of works. These were things you used to have. They seem to be a sort of extinct species now, but one used to have on buildings a clerk of works that was appointed to look after the client interest. So they were on site, not necessarily all day, but usually every day, to make sure that everything went together in according with the drawings and specification. Or if they didn't, because sometimes what was drawn couldn't be built, then they tried to solve it or got onto the design team, etc., saying, you've got a bit of a problem here, you know, can you come? Or I think we can do it like this, what do you think? And this was about the time we started having fax machines. So in fact, it was really good, the clerk of works, because you have instant communications between the clerk of works and the office, so much better than telephones and visits. But when we came to the handover of the building, on these slides generally, you know, black's normal, blue's good unless it's a heading, and red's bad. And I don't use green because green doesn't come out very well on some projectors, so blue's the better stuff. You find that there was a lot of stuff after the building was completed which wasn't right first time. It needed a lot of TLC in order to bolt down the design intent. Now, fortunately, they were lucky at the Elizabeth Fry building because they knew they were doing something special. They had the advantage of using this new for the UK technology. So they did actually get some government money for building research establishment to monitor its performance in use. And that showed, for example, that gas consumption was twice what it could have been. But they managed to get it down now, but only after replacing the control system. I mean, you could have never made a business case for replacing the control system, but UEA could make a business case for replacing the control system because they built a lot of buildings. So, you know, essentially to go up the learning curve, you know, that's what universities are supposed to do. A bit more difficult these days sometimes for their estates departments because of the way they are. So, I mean, the other thing about management vigilance, once they got this building to a state of good performance, can you keep it there? Now, one of the nice things about Elizabeth Fry's, it's very simple and straightforward. And most of the engineering kit is 4 air handling units in a plant room. You don't have radiators on the walls and things that students can swing on and they fall off. So, you know, essentially, once you've got it working, you can keep it going quite robustly, and I'll show you a bit about that in a moment. Now, the interesting thing is this building was written up in about 2002 now. There's a report by the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, which was mostly about minimizing CO2. It had a whole page case study of Elizabeth Fry. Didn't mention any of this. It just mentioned the technical menu. And what you get, I got a bit like cooking. You know, if you want to do a good meal, you know, you need the ingredients and the recipe and the kitchen and the chef. It's not just enough to have the ingredients and the recipe. You might end up with pig swill at the other end, you know. So essentially, we're often missing the point about how you get virtuous circles in complex systems which involve people, processes, and techniques and technologies. Well, I thought I'd just finish off with a party pooper here, because we're now here 10, 15 years later than these buildings, and what's happened to them? PSI has gone. Why? It was a perfectly good building, fit for purpose for a research institute, very good for a research institute. You know, UCL could have moved in for a number of things, but PSI moved into the University of Westminster. They, about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. So they became a unit in the University of Westminster. They moved there. Here's this building site. Residential is much more valuable than commercial in London. So bang, in goes the wrecking ball. So what's this? You know, this is only 20 years after they refurbished it. Well, you know, less, in fact, more like 15. What the hell are we doing? Is this sustainable? One Bridewell Street lost its manager. We've had that. Tanfield, which was fantastic when we looked at it in 95, was derelict in 2003. Derelict. Standard Life had moved out. Somebody had forgotten there was a problem with the heating. It had this big, wide building. The heating pipes went all around the outside. If you turned the boilers off, they contracted. There hadn't been enough allowance for thermal expansion. They cracked. So the facilities management knew that they had to keep the boilers running, but the letting agent didn't know. So essentially, why did Standard Life move out? Because the building was too bespoke. Essentially, the stock market crashed in 2000, 2001. Standard Life's books didn't look as healthy. This was a big building on their books with not a good exit strategy. So what they did is they sold, Standard Life Investments sold the building to Standard Life Properties, that then looked at it like property developer. And in about 5-7 years ago in Edinburgh, with the Scottish Parliament, etc., you know, housing costs and prices in Edinburgh just going through the roof. And the development equation said, you know, it's best to knock this down and turn it into houses. Then we had the 2007-08 recession. Hang on a moment. So in fact, what's happened to Tanfield House, it is still there, but it had to be divided up for letting. So what we had is these 3 atriums, this deep building, this is a listed facade here of the wool market, is they had to chop this atrium in here in order to make these big spaces subdivisible for letting. So you can see now there are 7 suites on floor, ACOMs on one of them. But, you know, so essentially it did survive, but again, you know, only just over a decade after this building was completed, you know, amazing building, lots of TLC, bang! We've got to be very careful about making buildings which are sophisticated but fragile. Fortunately, we got a rather better story at Elizabeth Fry. Sibsey gave us some money a couple of years ago to rerun the probe study. And so here we are in September 2011 at the weekend with Bisria's fan rover repressure testing it. Now, we got a surprise with the pressure test, because we found the air permeability was less than it was when we tested it in. It was tested first by Bisria on completion. It was then tested in probe. I think on completion it had a, I use air leakage index rather than air permeability because that's what we did probe in. You know, it had an air leakage index about 4.7. When we tested on probe, it was about 6 and a bit, and when we retested it, it was about 6. Now, there was actually there were 2 good reasons for that. One is they'd taken out the catering kitchen they used to have, and the catering kitchen had ventilation systems and things which weren't necessarily terribly well sealed up. But the other was, we found, my train was delayed, and I turned up late. And so, I wasn't very late, but they said, well, we've done a test, and the answer's 10. And I said, no, that's not right. This building isn't going to be 10. It can't possibly be 10. Now, what happened is we then went round and found out why, and we found a couple of windows were left open, but also the pressure test blew open the lecture room doors. Now, if that happens with a reputable research thing on the revisit, and it was the same team, how much can we test the results of some of these pressure tests? So I think, again, you know, things may not be exactly as they seem. Now, we also managed to rerun the Occupant Survey. Now, on the building use studies things, we've got a number of key indicators there, which you probably can't read, but temperature in summer, temperature in winter overall, air in summer overall, air in winter overall, lighting overall, noise overall, comfort overall, what the design of the building is like, whether it meets the occupier needs, whether you feel healthy in it, image to visitors, which actually hasn't got anything on there, and the perceived productivity. Now, what we've got here is that if the average score from the staff who answered the questionnaires in the building, and this was a staff survey, not a student survey, is statistically significantly better than the average for the reference data set at the 95% level, then the indicator goes green. If you can't tell the difference, it's amber, and if it's statistically significantly worse, it goes red. So what we had is something that very much swept the board in some of the key indicators. As Adrian said, there are many more indicators, but these are some of the key ones that come out. And particularly temperature in summer was pretty good. Often one finds in buildings that, you know, there's a fairly tight cohort of discontented people there. When we revisited it, it was similar, but it had dropped back a bit. So essentially the big drop back was on noise. The main reason for that is people knock down the partitions and stuff people in more spaces. So essentially the densities go up, the attenuation goes down, people complain a lot about noise and unwanted interruptions, and then that tends to put a hole in productivity. Well, the productivity is still statistically significantly above average, but you can see it has dropped back from plus about 10 percentage points to plus about 2 or 3 percentage points. Health was never fantastic. You know, it's all right, but that was something that didn't come through terribly strongly. And the image to visitors wasn't fantastic, so that's why it didn't win the architectural award, or sorry, the sustainability award. But nevertheless, this building has survived pretty well now through nearly 20 years. So I think it's completed in 1994. And if we look at the energy data, this is where we looked at it in 1997. This is where it was when the kitchen was actually used. The Sainsbury Centre was being refurbished, and so they moved the catering kitchen to there. So they actually, the catering kitchen was generally previously only just used as servery and only cooked in it very occasionally. That was the catering kitchen was actually Anglia. And then that's where we found it with 2010 data for 2011. So the lighting had gone up quite a bit. This was often because when they converted from cellular to open plan, they changed the lighting. And nobody seemed to have briefed the designers and contractors who changed the lighting on the energy efficiency standards. So I was measuring 1,200 lux and things. What are you doing? But we found again and again, we find things are procured with very wasteful specifications. But nevertheless, overall, this is a building which has been robust and has maintained pretty well its performance. Now, one of the things that it had when we surveyed it in 97 was very good seminar rooms. Because they had thermal capacity, they had mechanical ventilation, they stayed quite safe. The most popular seminar rooms in the university. Unfortunately, shortly after we did this survey, they knocked all the walls down and turned them into offices. Why? You know, here's this building with good thermal capacity. I mean, when we interviewed some of the administrators here, and they said, well, you know, we don't really need to be together here. You know, the senior management thought we needed to be together, but actually most of the communications we do between each other are by emails and things anyway. But often you get this churn in buildings, and then you can see you've got the most extraordinary things happening. This building had a concrete ceiling, and now a lot of it's been lost under bulkheads. The ventilation now doesn't work as well. You've got the outlet here, and this is the return. So, you know, a whole lot of things have been messed up by thoughtlessly considered changes. Why? Because the university, and this applies to most universities now, have no longer got the time to be a discerning and proactive client. More gets left to the market. And the market doesn't necessarily know what it's doing. So, back to innovation. I think I said a bit about that before, but so often, unfortunately, innovation seems to be novel. I got a lot of whizzy new so-and-so, rather purposeful improvement. Here's something which doesn't seem to be working. What do we do to make it better? And so, you know, if you don't understand how things work, we're finding again and again things are being mandated or things are being designed to improve buildings based on that looks like a good idea, rather than this needs to overcome the issues we've got, or this could enhance something that we've seen. So often technology is seen as the end rather than the means to the end. but this really important bit on robustness and resilience. You know, if we want buildings that are sustainable, they mustn't fall over if they don't have the right level of support and maintenance. And this goes back a bit to where I came in, because in 1972, I left the research lab in chemistry at Cambridge and went in to a firm of architects and engineers to brief on university laboratory buildings. But I did a number of things, but what happened in 1973, we had oil crisis, 3-day week, all sorts of industrial disruption in the UK. And then I got involved in environmental design and building services. And we were designing buildings for clients who said, we don't want to go there again. 3-day week, oil crisis, we had to send our staff home. What we want is a building that survives power cuts. So there were a number of buildings that we did, including Hereford and Worcester County Hall, and National Farmers Union head office in particular in Stratford, which were mixed-mode buildings, which were designed particularly to make as much use as they could of natural light and ventilation, but have mechanical services available when needed, so that they would actually collapse gracefully if the plug got pulled out on money or energy or support. But so often these days we're building fragile things and we're reaping a lot of unintended consequences. So we started off with new professionalism. This is the last slide of this particular chunk. And what's changed over the decades? You know, what's changed over the last 30 or 40 years? Well, one, we got a really strong environmental imperative with not much cash to respond to it. Two, you know, there is a lot of social and technological and economic change. A lot of things we take for granted now weren't there 20 years ago. World Wide Web wasn't there, I think. Well, it might have been there as ARPANET or whatever it was, but, you know, essentially not. You know, mobile phones, you had to cart a great brick around with a briefcase full of batteries and the rest of it. You know, lots of things are happening, but not so much in the buildings. And, you know, I think one thing is sort of equating buildings with these high-tech products can be very, very dangerous. But we are getting more and more complication. But is that really necessary? Is there a way that we can strip things back to things that work really well? Outsourcing is really dangerous because you can outsource your feedback loops and outsource your brain and then be totally dependent on the outsourced supplier because you don't have the capacity to technically manage them in the way, say, that Peter York, when he was bursar at UEA, was able to. And then we've got, you know, all these contracts and markets and things. You know, somebody said a quote, I forget, that government has become so transactional. It's all about transactions, it's all about so-and-so, but it seems to me the transaction, the best you can ever get is what you ask for. But that's not good enough. And then virtualization. So often it seems now that people are more at home in the virtual world than the real world, but buildings are really real-world objects. But again and again you get a situation of, you know, well, my design didn't work, or the model didn't seem to describe what happened, so there must be something wrong with the people. You know, it can't possibly be anything wrong with the way I'm looking at the world. There must be a problem out there. And then the whole thing of saying, well, where do we get the professionals, where do we get the leaders who can have the public interest in mind, who can join the dots, who can have the vision, but also take responsibility for the delivery in areas where we know the sort of thing we need to do, but we don't know quite how to do it because the engineering and the science and the management aren't fully locked down. But as I hope we've described to you in this talk, in spite of the fact that you haven't got a theory of everything, one often finds, you know, by looking at particular case studies, by looking at them in a broad way, you can begin to discern the sort of motors which can help things go into either virtuous circles where they get better or vicious circles where they get worse, and therefore create an agenda for the techniques and technologies that might enable us to do better. But of course, we've got public relations and things. So often, people want things to look good even if they aren't, and to bury bad news. So that's the end of part 1, and it's 1:45, so it could be the time for the refreshment break, but I'm rather inclined to do a bit of part 2, but I don't know what you think, but I'll hand over to Bob.